Okay, this lecture is about how women responded to the rise of industrial capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the intense labor exploitation that came with it. Women responded in various ways. Many joined the progressive movement and fought for government regulation of the worst abuses of capitalism. You could think of child labor here, so one of the worst abuses of capitalism being child labor. And many became very active in the labor movement and became socialists and anarchists. Middle class, elite, and professional women were more likely to be involved in the progressive movement, while working class women, many of them immigrants, became involved in labor unions and in radicalism. So the big ideas in this lecture are, first, that the rise of industrial capitalism transformed women's labor. Increasingly, women went to work in factories, in the North in particular. So women's labor is transformed. Two, the rise of industrial capitalism sparked massive immigration to the US, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, but also from Asia and Latin America. Immigration was, of course, shaped by gender. And three, lastly, with capitalism came increased poverty and exploitation and growing income inequality. And the result was pretty intense class warfare. Working class women participated in the labor movement in large numbers, both as participants and as leaders. They also looked for alternatives to capitalism and became attracted to anarchism and socialism in particular. So first, let's look at the definition of capitalism just to make sure we're all on the same page. Capitalism is, right, the economic system that we live under today. It's an economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of the means of production rather than public ownership. So that means the means of production refers to the workplace, right? Factories, Walmart, etc. Public ownership refers to ownership of the means of production, or let's just think factories for now, by the government or held in common, owned in common by the community. And capitalism is driven by the pursuit of profit, which entails hiring workers in exchange for wages. So the boss makes a profit, the employer makes a profit, and the workers are working for a wage. And the goods that the workers produce are sold on the free market. That's a very basic definition of capitalism. But most of this lecture is about industrial capitalism. So what is industrial capitalism? And with its rise in the 19th century, starting in the 1840s, 1850s, the question is, what was it and how did it transform life and labor in the United States? And globally, but our focus is the United States. So industrial capitalism means essentially mass production of goods by mechanization, due to mechanization or the use of machinery, the increasing use of machinery to produce goods. So rather than an economy organized around households and plantation slavery, we increasingly get the growth of factories and assembly lines, which increases production, but increasingly the concentration of wealth. It also produces the concentration of wealth and income in fewer and fewer hands, and the mass exploitation of working people. So these two things go hand in hand. Over the course of the 1800s, people are increasingly living in the city, either by abandoning their farms in search of work or immigrating directly to the city from abroad. So we see the growth, as a result of industrial capitalism, we see the growth of the city as factories are centered in and around cities or located in and around cities, and immigrants who are coming to the United States are primarily immigrating to cities to work in these factories. So in 1790, the entire country claimed only 24 towns or cities with populations greater than 2,500 people. And there was no city in 1790 that had a population greater than 50,000. And then by 1920, we see a huge transformation with the growth of the cities, and over half of the population lives in cities. So how did the rise of industrial capitalism in the 19th century begin to transform women's lives and how they labored? Well, for the first time, white female workers began to leave the household to work for wages in large numbers. To understand this, we have to look for a second at what women's labor looked like, how women labored, the kind of work that women did prior to the rise of industrial capitalism beginning in the mid-19th century. So in the early 1800s, there's of course slavery, a system dominant in the southern United States, which is quickly fading in the northern states due to gradual abolition, or the sort of movement to end slavery. What are other working people, though, non-enslaved people, doing to make a living? In the early 1800s, there was a household economy, what was called a household economy, that organized labor and production in New England and the North and elsewhere. And in this system, the home was a workplace, and the members of the nuclear family, so the wife, husband, and children, often many of them, depended on one another for economic survival. So most non-African Americans lived and worked on farms. So they do not work for somebody else for wages. They live in rural areas, not in cities. And in 1820, 3/4 of the labor force worked in agriculture. But the expansion of industrial capitalism leads to a huge expansion of wage labor, so the use of wage labor, and of course this transforms how people labor. By 1860, over 40% of people in the United States were employed outside of agriculture. In other words, we see a shift from just over 25% to 40%, right, of people employed outside of agriculture, which is a pretty large shift in not very much time. So in the first decades of the 19th century, the rise of industrial capitalism was made possible by improvements in transportation, I think canals, roads, and railroads, which helped to transport the goods that were being produced in factories, as well as the use of machines, so people working at machines in these factories. And women's lives are transformed by capitalism. In fact, young native-born white women in the 1830s and 1840s were some of the earliest factory workers. So these women, they moved from their farms to cities and towns to work in factories. So with the rise of the cotton textile industry, so some of the first factories in New England in the years between 1820 and 1860, large numbers of young women left their farms to work in cotton mills in particular, so cotton factories. And of course, textiles are just cloth, so this means that they're producing cloth in factories. The question is how were these textiles or cloth made before the growth of textile factories? Well, for the most part, as late as 1820, women working in their homes made two-thirds of all clothing produced in the United States. And much of the rest was actually imported from Great Britain. And most of the making of clothing was done for home consumption. It constituted, so this sort of production of clothing constituted a major element of women's contributions to the family economy in this period. Between 1820 and 1860, there was a huge demographic shift in New England. So with women moving from country farms to towns and cities to work primarily in these new textile factories producing cloth. By 1860, there were 60,000 women working in the textile industry in New England alone. And again, what makes this industrialization possible, what makes possible the sort of the growth of the textile industry and the transformation of women's labor is, number one, mechanization, the use of machines, and two, the textile factories grew because of the spectacular growth of the slavery-based plantation economy in the 1800s, which was very heavily based on the planting and cultivation of cotton. So this is when, in the early 1800s and throughout the 1800s, you get the growth of the cotton kingdom in the South. And without the growth of cotton by enslaved people, you would not see the growth of the textile industry, arguably, in the North. So the expansion of industrial capitalism was the main driving force for the massive immigration to the U.S. in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is this period of immigration, so from the 1880s through the 1910s, which you can see on this slide, is often referred to as the second great wave of migration. The first great wave is also in the 19th century, so 1830 to 1860, whereas the last great wave is from 1965 to present. And the reason why there's that big gap, right? You see on the slide it says the second great wave is from the 1880s to the 1910s, and then you have a huge gap in immigration. And the reason is because in the 1920s you have the rise of an anti-immigrant movement called the Nativist movement, and the very severe sort of restrictions placed on immigration. So most of this immigration happens in the 19th century, and this is when you see millions of European immigrants in particular immigrating to the United States. So this is the growth in part of the white population in the United States happens in the 19th century. So this immigration was part of a larger global phenomenon, the movement of workers, capital, and technology across national boundaries to enable entrepreneurs to exploit natural resources in more and more parts of the world. So what's happening is that globally, with the rise of industrial capitalism, peasants who had formerly grown food mainly for their own subsistence, their family subsistence, were being dislocated from the land by large growers, large agricultural owners. So in this context, right, of being displaced from the land, they're trying to figure out ways to make a living, and this spurs massive immigration. And there are several receiving countries for this immigration, but the receiving countries are primarily industrializing countries. So the United States is one of the big receiving countries in the 19th century. So let's see. This is another sort of visual, you can visualize immigration, right? That you can see here that most of the immigrants from 1870 to 1919 are coming from Europe. You got 23 million Europeans coming to the United States. You have less than 1 million people from Asia in this period, though prior to 1870 you had Chinese immigrants. And then, so in this pie chart on the right, the number of people coming from North and South America is 2,255,000 essentially, and about 1 million are from Mexico, and this is that come over in the 19-teens in the context of the American Revolution. And you have many fewer people who are coming from Africa in this sort of second great wave of immigration. So you can see that the second great wave is much larger actually than the first great wave of immigration. This is the biggest, I think, the largest number of immigrants come to the United States in this period of time, 1870 to 1919. So where did they come from? Let's look at a few of the places people are coming from. During the second half of the 19th century and early decades of the 20th century, almost 1 million people come from China, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and India. By contrast, we see about 35 million European immigrants who come to the United States. The three largest immigrant groups from Asia are from China, Japan, and the Philippines by far. And the vast majority of immigrants from Asia were men, though some women did immigrate. So for Chinese immigrants, you had the vast majority were men coming initially to work to strike it rich during the gold rush and the years following the gold rush, and then they also helped to build the transcontinental railroad. And so much of that labor was done by men, and there were very, very few women who came. And of the women who did come, many of them came over as prostitutes actually in the mid 19th century. So once European Americans started settling in the West in large numbers in the late 19th century, there was a racist backlash against Asian immigrants. In California, The anti-Chinese movement in particular was quite large and extremely violent. And this all culminates in the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which is the very first time that an immigration law passes that specifically targets an entire racial group for exclusion, right? So the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first time that a race had been excluded in immigration law. So in the late 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century, immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe immigrated to the United States in huge numbers. Like I said, about 30 to 35 million European immigrants came to the U.S. between 1850 and 1930. And for the bulk of this immigration, this period, there were absolutely no laws restricting European immigrants. So there's not one law, right? So there's no borders, essentially. Not that they're not vetted, right, as they enter, but there are, we don't have the same sort of immigration, or back then you didn't have the same kind of restrictions on immigration that we do today. So the bulk of European immigrants, when they came to the United States, came without being impeded by immigration law. So there's no, right, so I think that's really a key point to remember, that there's no immigration law here. The peak of this immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe occurred between 1900 and 1920, when about 13 million people immigrated. So they were mainly, when I say Southern and Eastern Europe, I mean mainly, right, people are coming from Italy, Southern Europe, Spain to a lesser extent. And for Eastern Europeans, you get most prominently Jewish immigrants fleeing persecution and violence in Eastern Europe, what were known as pogroms. So these new European immigrants faced widespread discrimination. Native-born white Americans often described Europeans from Eastern and Southern Europe as people from a lower level of civilization. Immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, so Russia, Italy, Poland, etc., were viewed sort of as a darker variety of European. They were perceived as being from a lower level of civilization, and part of that is based on religion, right? You have Jews from Eastern Europe, and you have Catholics from Spain and Italy. So these new immigrants, they're referred to as the new European immigrants, they replaced the older, supposedly whiter European immigrants from places like England, Scotland, and Germany. But unlike immigrants from Asia or Africa, most could at least claim citizenship through naturalization if they so chose. So we'll return to the topic of Mexican immigration and Latina history more later, but for now it's important to say that there was also an uptick in Mexican immigration in the early 20th century. So this was due, in large part, to the revolutionary violence of the Mexican Revolution. Between 1900 and 1930, approximately 1 million Mexicans immigrated to the United States. And for Mexicans, the Mexican Revolution, like I said, of the 19-teens, was a major push factor for immigration from Mexico. And most Mexican immigrants ended up in the southwestern United States, working in a variety of industries like the copper mines of New Mexico, the fields of California and Texas, in factories, etc. And because the push factor was violence, the violence of the revolution, there were many Mexican women who immigrated alongside men as well. So where did immigrants end up in the United States? European immigrants in the 19th and early 20th centuries mainly ended up in industries along the Atlantic coast and in the Midwest, so the East Coast and the Midwest. Asian immigrants ended up largely, though not exclusively, in the West, as did in places like California, the Pacific Northwest, Hawaii, and immigrants from Mexico and other areas of Latin America also ended up in the West, the Southwest and California most prominently. And most immigrants who came over were of modest means or were poor. They had acquired assistance from people in their village back home, assistance from labor agents or immigrants are relatives who had already immigrated who helped to finance their trip to the United States. So let's talk more about female immigration, gender and immigration. Did women and men immigrate in similar numbers? So the trend more recently when you're talking about immigration history is that women and men, women actually immigrate in larger numbers to the United States than men do. Part of that's complicated history, but the rise of the service sector and the decline of factories in the United States has a lot to do with that. So deindustrialization has a lot to do with that. But in the period we're talking about right now, in the late 19th century to the early 20th century, women generally comprise between 30 to 35% of immigrants, so a minority of immigrants. And why was this? So it was often the case that men migrated to the US and elsewhere to work and attempt to save money to send back home. In the meantime, women stayed home and cared for the family and often farmed. So these women who were left behind were referred to as, quote, the women who wait, and the men were often referred to as sojourners. Many men, especially Italian immigrants, ended up returning to their home countries, so not staying permanently in the United States. They returned to their families in their home countries. So for Jews, though, as refugees from anti-Semitic violence, Jewish immigrants tended to be more evenly divided between men and women. They would arrive more commonly as entire families, so the gender ratio was relatively even. Another reason is that Americans viewed independent female migration as a moral problem in the 19th century. So I'll repeat that. Americans viewed independent female migration as a moral problem in the 19th century. So if you're a woman looking to immigrate, you're either coming with a family or you're not, right? But for men, you could immigrate independently and it's not viewed, your immigration as a man is not viewed as a moral problem. And why was this? Why was it a problem for women to immigrate independently? Well, because it's a violation of traditional gender norms. Women were supposed to be naturally dependent on men. If they immigrated alone, they might be questioned as potential prostitutes or even as a potential public charge or a person. What it means to say a public charge is somebody who's going to rely on charity to survive, right? Because if women are naturally dependent on men, financially dependent on men, immigration agents and immigration viewed women as a potential public charge. So Chinese women immigrating through Angel Island off the west coast tended to undergo more extensive questioning than other immigrants because they were suspected of being prostitutes. In prostitutes, there's not much immigration law that exists aside from the Chinese Exclusion Act, but prostitutes are explicitly excluded from immigrating after the passage of the Page Act of 1875. And the Page Act was passed specifically to target Chinese women. So the first laws that are passed are meant to target Chinese immigrants in particular. So it's important to acknowledge that women and men, though they shared many experiences in common, also had distinct experiences due to their gender. Women, right, as often the carriers of culture, which we've talked about, were the carriers of culture, right? And this was also the case for immigrant families. Women tended to be, if they immigrated to the United States and families, they tended to be located in the cities. Men might be more likely to be located in the frontiers. So, for instance, you can think of men going to work in copper mines and of the Southwest of Arizona, or men working in the lumber camps of the Pacific Northwest. Most jobs for immigrant women were in the cities, so the factory work that they could find in the textile factories and the garment factories most prominently were located in big cities, not in frontier towns. The industries that women were employed in were, like I said, textiles, garment factories, but also canneries. Some women worked in agriculture, domestic service, as well as in sex work or prostitution. For native-born white women, they were more likely to work in offices as clerks, typists, and secretaries. Women also did what was called piecework in the home, and their children often helped them out during this work. And piecework was you would take a cloth home and do labor in the household. So you would stitch together, right, the clothing out of this cloth, out of the textiles, in your living room, and the children would help you do this labor. So immigrant women worked in factories like men, but they did different kinds of labor within factories, and were paid about half to 2/3 of what men were paid. So they were paid a lot less than men, about half to 2/3 of what men were paid. And they also, of course, as you know, had to do the double day. So if they worked in a factory, say in a garment factory for a wage, right, they would have to come home and they would work a 12, 14, 16-hour day. And they would have to do the cooking, laundry, taking care of children, right? And keeping infants, remember, alive at this point in time was very hard work. In New York, as many as a quarter of all babies actually died in their first 2 years of existence, usually as a result of spoiled food or milk during summer months. So women of an extended family and neighbors often had to share domestic work. For instance, while one woman went out to work in the factory, a female cousin, not a male cousin, might look after her children, or the oldest daughter might or maybe an older woman might take care of the children. So these extended family members would help take care of the children. So, in 1900, 18.3% of the labor force was female. This would reach 21.4% by 1920. More than half of the female working population was foreign-born or non-white. And in 1900, the average woman worker made about half of what the average male worker earned. And this disparity reflected this, right, the unequal wages between men and women reflected the fact that men and women largely worked in different occupations and in distinct industries. It also reflected a highly structured, what's called sexual division of labor that limited working women's options, even as this division of labor shaped the American labor force, right? So the sexual division of labor, certain kinds of wage labor are appropriate for women, certain kinds of wage labor are appropriate for men, shaped the American labor force. Domestic service, so domestic work was still the largest category of female employment, but manufacturing work in the factories was steadily gaining ground. Mothers and wives who worked outside the home for wages were few. Only among African Americans did they actually constitute a significant portion of women workers. So mothers and wives, if they were not black, were less likely to work for a wage, but African Americans who were mothers and wives constituted a significant portion of the female workforce. So clerical workers was a profession that was once reserved for men. But in the early 20th century, clerical work was becoming what's called feminized, as well as mechanized and routinized. So that means, right, it's becoming feminized means that it's increasingly becoming an occupation that's meant for women, so feminized. It's becoming mechanized and routinized. So it's becoming when the word routinized refers to the labor being more routine, right? You're being overseen by male bosses, right? That sort of thing. So women did a clerical work for mail order houses, banks, insurance companies, large corporations, and the labor of secretaries and typists was beginning increasingly to look like factory work. And this image on this slide sort of gives you some sense of what clerical work or secretarial work was beginning to look like. And you can see that there's a man here who is kind of overseeing the female workers. So men, of course, were always the boss. And of course, most of this labor was done, the work of being a clerical worker or a secretary was mainly reserved for white women. It was very rare for women of color to be hired into these positions. So even though this work is still exploited, it's still relatively better paid and more respected and valued by society than than the work that women of color were made to do. So due to the increase in women's access to college education in the 19th century, there was actually a growing, but still small, professional class of women. Women were increasingly becoming things like doctors, right? So, or nurses. Women made up between 5 and 6% of the medical profession by 1900. When it came to the law, though, the legal profession was much more hostile. In 1900, fewer than 600 women were practicing law in the United States. But by 1920, this number had tripled. But even for women who were able to become lawyers, it was often very difficult for them to actually attain a job at a law firm practicing law. So a more common professional job was, or professional career was social work. And social work actually evolved out of the volunteer labor of progressive era women reformers in the settlement houses in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The sort of labor that was done in the settlement houses, right, was sort of charitable labor. It was meant to help the exploited working class people, particularly women, who were living in poverty, who were having a very difficult time surviving in American society under industrial capitalism. By 1920, there were 30,000 trained social workers in the United States, and the vast majority of them were women. And even today, women dominate in the profession of social work. So that there have been some changes. More men are social workers, but I think it's still a pretty feminized occupation. So there's also nursing and teaching. These were the largest professions dominated by women. The two professional careers that were open to women were nursing and teaching. So between 1900 and 1910, there was a tenfold increase, for instance, in the number of professionally trained nurses. So teaching was a woman's occupation at the primary level, so elementary school level, since the 1830s. But teacher training moved from 2-year high school level institutions of the late 19th century to 4-year collegiate institutions by the 20th century. Okay, so the question is, why was salary and waged work increasingly opening up to women? And what does it mean to say the feminization of labor? So, occupations like teaching, like nursing and clerical work became thoroughly feminized in the 19th and 20th centuries because feminized labor is characterized by a few things. Number one, right, these defining characteristics of what it means, what feminized labor is, or what the kind of labor that is dominated by women, the kind of labor that's viewed as women's labor. So first of all, it's caring labor, right? So you're doing the work of caring for other human beings. Nurses obviously care for other human beings. Teachers, elementary school teachers, care for children. So jobs that became feminized were often an outgrowth of women's place in society prior to industrialization. 2, feminized labor was underpaid and undervalued labor, right? So there's an incentive to hire women because you can pay them less than you pay men. Women were paid less in jobs that were feminized, right? So, and thus, for instance, school districts had an incentive to open up teaching to women. Where once teaching used to be dominated by men, it became dominated by women, especially at the elementary school level in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. 3, feminized labor was characterized by having bosses, managers, employers who are men, right? So in nursing, doctors were men. In teaching, principals were men. In clerical work, your boss, the lawyers, the managers, and so on, were also men. So thus the so-called natural gendered hierarchy, right, or patriarchy exists, could remain in place because women, even when they work for a wage, are still being supervised or managed or bossed around by men above them. Finally, women, particularly white women, all women, were still responsible for household labor, even if they worked 16 hours a day. Right. So also for many of these jobs, once married women were actually expected to quit, or they were just fired because they were supposed to go home and take care of their children and husband. So it was perfectly legal for women to be fired when they got married, and it was actually quite common for women to be fired when married, especially if you were a white woman. Much less likely for black women to be fired when married, because there's a long history of black women working, doing wage labor. So these gender norms are different depending on what race you're talking about. Okay. So now I want to turn to factory work, where 25% of female workers, right, were working in factory work. And part of this story, this history, is talking about the labor movement. So that's why I want to turn to factory work, because this is where you see working class women getting active in unions. The women who got active in unions were actually doing factory work. So the first thing is, what is a union, right? So a union it just represents workers. So it's an organization that workers elect to represent them, to negotiate pay and benefits with the manager or with your boss. So you negotiate a contract that outlines all of your pay, your benefits, talks about your working conditions as a worker. The basic definition is that it's just an organization that workers elect to form, that they choose to form, to defend and advance their rights. Right? It doesn't have to just be limited to negotiating a contract with the boss, but that's often what unions sort of limit themselves to, especially these days. So labor union, right? The reason people form unions is because you have a lot more collective power as part of an organization than you would have as an individual. Can you imagine being a low-paid textile worker or working in a garment factory, and as an individual going up to your manager and asking for a wage? In that instance, right, in that situation, the boss has complete leeway to say yes or no. But if you organize a union, you have the sort of power in your organization, the collective organization, right? You can do things like go on strike if the boss refuses to give you a wage increase. You could do things like sit down at your machines on the factory floor and refuse to work collectively until your demands are achieved. So there's a lot more power in a union than just being an individual worker. That much is clear. So there are different. I don't want to go into this in too much depth, but there are different approaches to unionism. Today, there are different approaches to what it means to be a union, as there were in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So the first approach is craft unionism, which was best represented by a labor union called the American Federation of Labor, which was founded in 1886. And it was actually, it excluded unskilled workers, leaving out of its ranks African American workers, women, these new European immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, and it was quite racist and sexist. And it actually mainly represented, the American Federation of Labor mainly represented the skilled crafts. So not unskilled factory labor, but the more skilled kinds of work in the industrial economy. And so it tended to be more conservative, right? So you can see from that description that these unions often promoted racism and sexism, that it was more conservative. And then there's industrial unionism, which was best represented by the Industrial Workers of the World. So this was the Industrial Workers of the World was a revolutionary union founded in 1905. And unlike the American Federation of Labor, the IWW, or the Industrial Workers of the World, right, that's the acronym, organized unskilled workers regardless of gender or race. Some of the largest strikes in the early 20th century were actually led by women workers and women who were organizers with the industrial workers of the world. So you can tell, right, that industrial unions like the IWW tended to be more radical because they were more inclusive. And they organized unskilled workers, not just the more highly paid skilled workers. So every step of the way, women not only had to fight their bosses to improve their conditions, but they had to contend with men in the labor movement who tried to exclude them, talk down to them, pay female organizers less than male organizers, and even sexually harass them on a routine basis. So the American Federation of Labor, for instance, was totally dominated by men. It regarded women not as potential union members, but rather largely as underpaid threats to their male members' jobs, right? Or just pitiful victims of capitalist greed. So the AFL did not try and organize women by and large. There are some exceptions, but by and large. So there was a union called the Women's Trade Union League that was formed in 1903 to meet the needs of women workers. And you know something about this from the article by Annalise Orlick, the author, historian Annalise Orlick. So the Women's Trade Union League is key in this history because it is, of course, established exclusively to deal with the issues of women workers. But it was interesting. It was led by actually elite women of the leisure class who wanted to help out poor women. It organized the women workers that the AFL refused to organize. So it was led by more elite women or well-off women, but it was what I would call a cross-class alliance of elite women and working class women sort of in the same organization. So the Women's Trade Union League worked in behalf of white and immigrant working class women. In particular, it had a rather weak record when it came to organizing black female workers. So it mainly was organizing white women and immigrant women. And after the First World War, which ends in 1918, the Women's Trade Union League shifted its emphasis from trade union organization to working on reforming the law. So it tried to, for instance, pass maximum workday laws and minimum wage laws for working women. So I want to take a couple of minutes to highlight a couple of massive labor struggles that women took the lead on. So there's the Uprising of the 20,000, which was led by the union, the ILGWU, or the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. From 1909 to 1910, it led the Uprising of the 20,000, in which tens of thousands of young women, workers, went on strike. They left their workplace, they went on strike to protest poor working conditions. It consisted mainly of young Italian women and Jewish women in particular who worked in the garment factories. They endured in their factories, they endured harassment by their bosses, right? Thugs that their bosses had hired. They were arrested. During the strike, they endured harassment by thugs that their bosses had hired. They were arrested by police. They were often beat up, and they were sent to jail for protesting. The involvement of elite women from the Women's Trade Union League, who were subject to disrespectful treatment by the police, made the newspapers take notice of the police brutality. And after nearly 3 months, because of this attention that the strike was receiving in the newspapers, the strike was settled. Many, but not all, of the manufacturers agreed to a 52-hour work week no more fines for workers' mistakes, and more worker involvement in setting wages, and even paid holidays. Um, but they would not allow, so one major failure of the strike is that they did not allow the ILGWU to represent workers in future negotiations. So in other words, they did not establish the union at all of these different factories. Rather, they just won some short-term demands. So they hadn't set themselves up to be in a position of strength to negotiate with their employers in the future. So a year after the strike, a really big tragedy occurred that would highlight why union recognition was so important for the workers. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company had begun locking its doors of its factory in Manhattan after the workers arrived, and the idea was to keep union organizers out of the factory, but also to keep workers in at all times. And on March 25th, 1911, a massive fire broke out on the 10th floor of this Triangle Shirtwaist Company factory. Workers found that they could not get out. They were locked inside the building, and in desperation, they ran up to the roof. Some were able to escape, but overall, 146 workers, more than a quarter of the entire workforce, died in the fire. Many of them jumped from the upper floors of the building to their deaths to avoid being burned to death. At a massive funeral held a few days later, Rose Schneiderman delivered a bitter eulogy. She said, "This is not the first time girls have been burned alive in this city. Every year, thousands of us are maimed. The life of men and women is so cheap and property is so sacred. There's so many of us for one job, it matters little if we are burned to death." Unquote. So another example of a massive strike led by women was the Lawrence textile strike. Women continued to organize, right, and despite this tragedy, actually to prevent tragedies like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire from happening again. In 1912, a strike of 30,000 textile workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts happened, and it was one of the biggest strikes led by the industrial workers of the world in this period. The workforce consisted mainly of immigrants. There were Portuguese, English, Irish, Russian, Italian, Syrian, German, and Polish immigrants, all working at factories in Lawrence, Massachusetts. So, like most industrial workers, most factory workers, the textile workers in Lawrence worked very long days, right? We're talking 14-hour days, 16-hour days. The average wage was around $8.76 per week. This is the equivalent to about $210 per week in today's dollars, but this is not a 40-hour work week, right? $210 per week for working like 60, 70, 80 hours a week. The workforce was primarily women, but it also had children working in the factories. The strike was started by the workers to protest low pay in particular. And the workers were ignored by the American Federation of Labor, which again was not interested in organizing unskilled female workers or immigrant workers from from Southern and Eastern Europe. So the workers called in the industrial workers of the world to help organize the strike. There are the leaders of the strike. There are a bunch of leaders, but perhaps one of the most prominent, especially for our purposes, was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was a second-generation Irish immigrant. She was a single mother and an accomplished organizer and public speaker. And in Lawrence, Massachusetts, she particularly encouraged greater involvement among Italian women whose enthusiasm for the struggle went against their reputation as isolated and conservative. The government called in the state militia to violently put down the strike, and martial law was declared. 36 strikers were arrested. A young Syrian striker named John Ramey was bayoneted to death by one of the militiamen. And this one turning point in the strike involved the children of the town's workers. So as food was running out and as police and militia attacks increased, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn decided it was time to send the younger children to the homes of out-of-town sympathizers. The IWW and the Socialist Party organized what was called a children's exodus. So for the children to stay with supporters in New York City. Upon arrival in New York on February 10th, the children were greeted by 5,000 Italian socialists who were singing songs like the Internationale. The attention paid to the children's exodus helped to spark national outrage, which ultimately helped to bring the strike to a close. And it ended, right? The strike ended when the American Woolen Company agreed to give in, offering raises of 5 to 11%. And the strikers, interestingly, insisted that the largest increases go to the lowest paid workers. They also got time and a quarter for overtime. On March 14th, 1912, 10,000 strikers gathered at a meeting and voted to end the strike. So the dedication and militancy of the women in New York and Lawrence, and in labor conflicts elsewhere in the United States, helped to transform the popular image of working women. Right? They're no longer dependent on others to defend and protect them. Whereas before they were not appreciated, right, for their ability to fight their own battles. They're proving to the rest of the country and the labor movement that they can lead these sort of strikes and they can win. By the beginning of World War I, the number of women in trade unions, in labor unions, had quadrupled. So it had grown by 4 times in just the matter of a couple of decades. Though women would remain a minority in the labor movement, they continue to face, because they continue to face many obstacles, right, due to male dominance of unions. So most male union leaders prioritized organizing male workers and not female workers. Okay, I want to talk for a second about the culture of the labor movement in the early 20th century. The IWW in particular promoted a labor culture among workers that helped to create communities of struggle. Imagery put out by the IWW became quite well known, and many people to this day continue to use some of this imagery, like, for instance, the sabotage cat, which was supposed to represent sabotage in the workplace. And songs, there were also there was a lot of singing in the labor movement. A lot of the songs that labor activists sing today are actually songs that were first written in the early 20th century or in the 1930s, the second sort of big moment for labor in U.S. history. So there's a song that I would recommend called The Rebel Girl. I'll play a couple of minutes, or maybe a minute right now. It's Rebel Girl, and it was actually written by singer-songwriter Joe Hill, who was with the Industrial Workers of the World, and about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the leader of that Lawrence textile strike in 1912.
There are women of many descriptions in this cruel world, as everyone knows. Some are living in beautiful mansions and are wearing the finest of clothes. There's the blue-blooded queen or the princess who have charms made of diamonds and pearls. But the only and thoroughbred lady is the rebel girl.
Okay. Just going to fast forward through a couple of these. You can see that some of the imagery of the Industrial Workers of the World was quite masculine in nature, right? So they're not foregrounding the involvement of women, even though they included women in their organizing. They mainly described men, right, the workers as men who were strong. Look at like this one, who could fight off, right, or challenge the exploitation that they were experiencing by their bosses. Okay, let's talk a little bit about socialism and anarchism. These two political philosophies were at their height in U.S. history in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And socialism is defined as, and they were at their height because workers who were very, very exploited, working very long days for very little pay, right? And, you know, they were working in mines and factories where the conditions were very dangerous. They wanted an alternative to capitalism, to the abuses of capitalism, and so they looked to the ideologies or the political philosophies of socialism and anarchism. So for socialism, right, it's essentially any variant of economic and political theories advocating collective or government ownership and administration of the means of production and the distribution of goods. So rather than corporate ownership, private ownership, the idea here is that society somehow collectively owns the factories, or government owns the factories. So the idea is that if the government owns the factories, abuses would not be that would take care of the abuses in the factories, because you get rid of the profit incentive, right? So you have corporate leaders they establish these corporations primarily because they're trying to make a big profit. And to make a big profit, the idea is for most of them is that you're trying to pay workers as little as possible and take as much money out of this whole process as you can. There's also anarchism, which was a variant of socialism. It's a political theory holding all forms of governmental authority to be unnecessary and undesirable, and advocating society based on voluntary cooperation and free association of individuals or groups. So anarchists in the 19th and 20th centuries also advocated the overthrow of capitalism. So they wanted to get rid of all unaccountable authority. They wanted to get rid of the government, which they saw as being in league with corporate leaders, capitalists, and they also wanted to overthrow capitalism itself and establish an economy that was based on free cooperation, right, between individuals or groups. So essentially, workers would run the factory themselves rather than one boss running the factory. So anarchists generally advocated free. They were much more into sort of criticizing hierarchy and advocating freedom, individual freedom as well as group freedom. Let's see what else. So hundreds of thousands, even millions of people actually responded favorably to anarchist and socialist politics. And a couple of women I want to highlight are, and this is coming to an end here, are Emma Goldman and Voltarine de Cleyre. So there was a radical feminism that was associated with socialism and anarchism in the early 20th century. Both of these women, Voltarine de Cleyre and Emma Goldman, were anarchists, and they were feminists. And often Emma Goldman is known today as being a feminist, but she was a very prominent anarchist in this time period, in the early 20th century. So Goldman was a fierce opponent of the government and of capitalism. She was also outspoken in support of a version of feminism that went beyond calling just for the vote for women, right? She demanded sexual freedom, she criticized marriage, she advocated for birth control. And Voltarine de Cleyre was very similar, right? Anarchists who were also feminists were way ahead of their time in the sense that they were actually calling for sexual freedom, and even many of them offered up a defense of gay rights or homosexuality. Voltarine de Cleyre grew up in a Catholic convent and came to criticize Catholicism and Christianity more generally, particularly because she thought that that Christianity promoted women's subservience to men. Goldman gave large public lectures across the country on these and other topics. Voltarine de Cleyre also spoke publicly, but she was a prolific writer. So Goldman was arrested more than 40 times while she, at the height of her activism in the early 20th century, for making obscene statements, so-called obscene statements publicly. If she called for talking about birth control was considered obscene, defending gay rights was considered obscene, criticizing marriage was considered obscene. So here's one example of Goldman's criticism of marriage. She described marriage, quote, as a parasitic institution, as, quote, an economic arrangement and insurance pact that makes women dependent on their husbands for survival. Okay, finally, to conclude, I just want to reiterate the 3 points that I started the lecture with. That first and foremost, the rise of industrial capitalism transformed women's labor. Increasingly in the 19th century, women are leaving the household to work in factories for wages in the North in particular, where industrial capitalism first takes off. The South is more underdeveloped because of the plantation economy. And second, the rise of industrial capitalism sparked massive immigration to the United States, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, but also from Asia and Latin America. And the way that this immigration took shape was also influenced by gender. We talked a bit about that. Lastly, with capitalism came increased poverty and exploitation and growing income inequality. And the result was straight up class warfare, as women and others became active participants and leaders in the labor movement and other radical movements of the day.